Hi, everybody. This is Ronelle Delmont, and I'm going to talk to you today about your favorite topic, the 50s. It's everybody's favorite topic because everyone knows nothing important happened in the 50s. It was a decade of just lovely lifestyle. Uh, the middle class came into being. Everybody had enough to eat. There was no war. Well, there was a war called Korea, but everyone remembers the 50s in very pleasant terms. And so pleasant that we think nothing important happened. But I'm going to show you that many profound effects upon our life today happened in the 1950s. Now, I have a slideshow. If you're interested in reading a book about the 50s, one of the best ones was written by a man named David Halberstam. He's no longer alive, but his book is 800 pages, and I'm sure you can find something in there that will jog your memory in case you forgot what the 1950s was all about. So I'm going to share the screen. I'm going to go to my PowerPoint slideshow right here, and hopefully we can get the slideshow going. Slideshow from the beginning. There we go. Okay, so let us see what happened in the 50s. Well, you probably got a photograph that looks something like this. That's Mrs. Wilkenfeld or Miss Wilkenfeld. Our teachers were never married, or if they were, they never told us. Miss Wilkenfeld is sitting there. I used to think she was quite old, but she looks very nice to me today. Here I am, Ronelle Beanstalk. And as you can see, the girls went to school in dresses with pretty socks and shoes. We never wore pants in the freezing cold snowstorms. We never had the advantage that the boys had to wear pants and be comfortable and warm. And that was from Brownsville, Brooklyn, PS 184 on Stone Avenue in Brownsville, 1956. I was 12 years old. And when you were 12 years old, you probably have similar photographs. I just love looking at this. And this is basically what America looked like in the 50s. I have no idea who these people are, but I thought I'd show you to remind you how we dressed as a country. We looked lovely and all put together. Nobody's wearing ripped jeans. Everybody looks like they're going somewhere nice, respectable, and every woman wanted to look glamorous like these ladies from Vogue magazine. These dresses are not out of style, even though it's from the 1950s. These are fashionable today, and you cannot tell the difference. If you look at this, if I didn't tell you it was from a 1950s magazine, you wouldn't know. 17 magazine. I worshiped this magazine as a child, and I couldn't wait to grow up and be 17 to wear stuff like this. Well, I did. I did wear stuff like that. That's exactly what I wore. Clothes that were styled this way. And on eBay, you could sell these schmatters for a lot of money if they're the original vintage ones. So I hope you didn't throw away your old schmatters. Here's a beautiful blouse that cost under $5. It's at least $50 to $100 on eBay today because it's an original vintage blouse. And the bobbing. Oh, I can never forget the smell of this stuff. It was atrocious. I didn't do it more than once. It was disgusting to me, the smell and the chemicals. When I was a child in the 50s, my mother, my aunts, and all of their friends, they would get together, especially when we went up to the Catskill Mountains. They would get together and they would do each other's hair with henna, Egyptian henna. They'd all become redheads overnight. But I don't remember any of my relatives using this bobby, but it was quite popular. And the Catalina bathing suits, which if you have an old one, an original, it's probably worth about 100 something dollars, 150. I've seen them go on eBay. And these are not so stylish today because nobody would put themselves in such a contraption anymore. Everyone today lets it all hang out. And in the 50s, you didn't let anything hang out. Here is a saddle shoe. I think the boys were wearing these too, if I remember correctly, but they were girls. I thought of them as girls' shoes. And this example is a brand new one. They remade them when the 50s became popular. And of course, you couldn't go to Miami Beach and walk on the boardwalk without one of these. No, no, no. You had to have your fur stole. This is an original from the 50s. I don't think they make them anymore today, so you better get on eBay and buy one, vintage one, or drag it out of your closet if you've got one, because you can't walk on Miami Beach without this. And again, like I said earlier, this is Vogue magazine from the 50s, and this is how women look glamorous. You would not know that this was a 50s photograph because this is still glamorous. It's newly glamorous today to look like this. The 50s are back in. This is what a young man would look like. Another young man, bow tie, and look at that hairdo. That was the look of the 1950s. Well, two characters that you're familiar with, at least one of this couple, you may recognize him. I think you give you a minute to look at his face. This is J. Edgar Hoover and his boyfriend Clyde Tolson. The FBI dominated the news in the 50s like they did every decade. J. Edgar Hoover was a snazzy dresser, and they hung out here in Miami Beach at Joe's Stone Crab, the Roney Plaza, the Eden Rock Hotel. They went everywhere, and they were dressed in the fashionable 1950s style. And while they were dressed like that, Patti Page sang her beautiful song, How Much Is That Doggy in the Window? Yes, she was lovely, and everybody listened to her about her doggy in the window. Now, this fellow, I put this picture up for a reason, for a couple of reasons. Number one, he was the biggest seller of books, of Cold War novels, cheap thrillers. His name was Mickey Spillane, and he's wearing a pair of, I know you think I'm going to say jeans. I'm not going to use that word. I'm going to say dungarees. Anyone remember the word dungarees? I remember it very well because I didn't have jeans. I had dungarees. And when you were going to put on your dungarees, you were doing it only for one reason. You were going to get very dirty, or possibly very dirty. Maybe you were, maybe you weren't. You were going to play hopscotch. You were going to roller skate. Maybe you were going to paint your house. Whatever it was that you wore these pants for, it was because it was a dirty job. Nobody went to an opera or to a doctor's appointment or anywhere other than the garage or around the neighborhood in these slacks. I still don't own a pair of these. I still don't wear them. I haven't worn them since I was a hippie in the 1960s with the bell bottom. But nowadays they cost a lot of money and they're fashionable enough for you to go to, I don't know, today was the inauguration of a new president. Probably a lot of people were wearing these at the inauguration. But in the 50s, you didn't wear them unless it was a dirty, dirty job. So there's another reason I'm showing this photograph of Mickey Spillane. It's because of this book rack that he's standing next to. And all of these paperbacks, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, wow, 21 books he wrote. Very successful author. But the paperback industry, that's what I want to mention here. The paperback industry really didn't flourish until the 1950s. Families like mine that were very poor didn't have so much money. $4 a book, $5 a book. People, even in the Depression, didn't buy books because they were too expensive. But by the 1950s, the war was over, the printing presses started beating again, and the paperback industry exploded in the 1950s. That's a very important effect because people who could not afford $4 for a book could now afford a quarter, 25 cents, 35 cents. Maybe you paid 75 cents for a book. And my family suddenly had big library, not as big as the library. We worshiped the public library. In the 40s, when I was a little girl, I could go and pick out as many books as I want and bring them back. And the public libraries were places of worship to my family. But then the 50s, we could afford a lot of books. And Nicky Spillane, I did not read his books. I would not have liked them. Here he is up close with his typewriter. His biggest fan, one of his biggest fans, was a woman named Ayn Rand. She loved his books, even though they were misogynist stories. Mickey Spillane killed off a lot of women. He raped a lot of women. He executed a lot of women. As you see here, the covers, this is one cover of a famous Signet book. I think this one was 25 cents. Vengeance is Mine. 3,500,000 copies were sold of this book. One Lonely Night, a sensational new mystery. Yes, these women were abused and used, and they were not very nice stories, but I guess people found them exciting because they sold like hotcakes. And the reason that all these women were being tormented in his stories is because they were spies. They were always commie spies. And let us remember that this is the era of the Cold War. The height of the Cold War was the 1950s when Stalin was still alive up until 1954. Joseph Stalin, who is the victor over Hitler, in case you don't remember, and I've talked about this many times, it was the Russians who kept Hitler out of their country and were victorious against Nazism. So communism was flourishing within the country of the USSR. They had no plans to export communism. Stalin did not have any plan to export communism, but you wouldn't know it from Mike Hammer. This was a television show, and all of Mickey Spillane's books enabled the foreign policy of America's government to make all of us think that the communists were under the bed, around the corner. They were going to get us if we didn't have people like Mike Hammer and Mickey Spillane. So Lenin had died in 1924. Stalin took over, and he was still there till 1954. So there was Mike Hammer, and there's the hammer and the sickle. Just to remind you of the grave threat that we all lived under, hiding under desks from them. So the Cold War instigated great fear in every American's heart. We went to the movies. In this case, in my life, it was the Loews Pitkin. We were living in Brownsville at that time, and there were all kinds of films every Saturday that my mother used to give me a tuna fish sandwich in a brown paper bag, and I would walk to the movie 10 blocks away by myself at the age of 9 and 10. Nobody harmed me, and I would get to the theater early enough to watch 20 cartoons for 50 cents they charged on a Saturday afternoon. And then after the cartoons came a B movie of cowboys with Randolph Scott and the Indians, and then would come the science fiction thriller. It was always the case of an ant, a bee, a cockroach, some ugly insect that got radiated from atomic energy, grew to be the size of a giant building and began eating people. And in every film, the insect had to be put to death. They had to be eradicated because humanity and life on Earth was at stake. Well, subliminally, Hollywood was doing the Cold War theme. This was my favorite, and I still love this film. It's great. It's called Them. Oh, it was wonderful. The giant ants, and it was just a wonderful thriller. Scared me to death, of course. And then there was Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And you got the feeling that something was out there, whether it was an ant that grew to the size of a building, or whether it was the creature from the Black Lagoon, or it was Stalin and his brigade, whatever it was, we had to be scared in the 50s. And there was plenty to scare us. The Cold War, we hid underneath wooden desks. Now, I was a fat little child, chubby, and I wore dresses to school because you couldn't wear pants. And I had to hide under a wooden desk. You know how hard that was to do in New York City? Oh my God. And what were we hiding from? We were hiding, believe it or not, if you can remember this. First of all, I had a dog tag around my neck. It was made of aluminum. It had my name and address on it. And I don't know what that aluminum dog tag was going to do, except the hydrogen bomb. Are you kidding me? In the 50s, J. Robert Oppenheimer and Edward Teller, the two physicists who had worked on the atomic bomb, they went head to head in a military tribunal, a trial, a secret trial, in which J. Robert Oppenheimer was kaput. I don't have pictures of this in the slideshow, but maybe you remember that there was a confrontation in science, American science, between those physicists who did not want to go on making nuclear weapons because they realized Hitler didn't have it and they didn't want to engender an arms race. So they were not interested in making anything bigger than the bombs that were dropped on Japan, atomic energy bombs. But Edward Teller said no, 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 and he had a following in the State Department and the military. They wanted to make bigger and bigger and better bombs, such as the thermonuclear or the hydrogen bomb. Those bombs are 1,000 times bigger than the atomic bomb that this child is hiding from under his desk. Actually, in the 50s, he's hiding from the thermonuclear, or actually the hydrogen bomb, which is 1,000 times bigger. So I don't know what good that desk is doing the kid. And if he's wearing a dog tag, that's not doing him any good either. So that was the era when we thought nothing important was happening. The development of thermonuclear weapons, to which when Soviet Union goes out of business in 1990, there are 60,000 of those nuclear weapons on the earth. Then comes, well, the better news is this book. This was a wonderful bestseller. By the way, we don't have 60,000 thermonuclear weapons anymore. We're down to 20,000, if that makes you feel any better. But it all came out of the 50s. Very important moment in human history was the 50s for that reason alone. Anyway, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit was written by a man who came out of the war in Europe. He was an American author named Sloan Wilson, and you may remember this book if you read it. Maybe you want to read it again because it's still good today. It's about a man based on Sloan Wilson's own experiences. Having come back from a war in which he had to kill people and wear a new uniform, and that uniform was a gray flannel suit. Back in the 50s, if somebody had a best-selling novel and Hollywood wanted to make a film of it, well, it didn't take years like it does today. A book might take 20 years to become a film in the present time in which we live, with all the I don't know what takes them so long, honestly, but it has to do with legalese and lawyers and whatever. But back in the 50s, you could write a book, and a few months later, within the same year, you could have a screen version. And this is a wonderful version made by Darryl Zanuck, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, starring Gregory Peck, Jennifer Jones, and Frederick March. It's a wonderful film to watch. And as I said, it's about the 50s. The husband comes back from war, and now he sits on a train. And this is Gregory Peck here reading a newspaper from Westport, Connecticut, where he now lives. People used to live in the cities, now they live in the country. Not the country, they live in suburbia. And they're on the train to work in a big tower of a building in a gray flannel suit, which is a new army. He comes home, his wife, Jennifer Jones, picks him up. Mr. and Mrs. Rath, Tom and Betsy Rath, are the characters in this story, and they love each other deeply, but they don't know what's wrong with their marriage. Something terrible is happening. They fight all the time. Nothing is going right. When she picks him up at the station, one day the dishwasher is broken. They need to buy a new one, and they don't have enough money. He only makes, I think it's $6,000 a year, if I'm not mistaken, and that's not enough for their dishwasher, for their refrigerator. The kids have the chicken pox, and their lives, um, their lives develop into misery, and they don't know why. They don't know what's happening to them. What's happening to them is the 1950s, and culture is changing, and values. American people are beginning to be middle class, and they have ideas of success and advancement, and that's what the book is all about. I still cry when I see the ending of this movie. It's a beautiful, beautiful film. And they figure it out at the end of the book, so don't worry. They stay married. I'm giving you a hint. They do stay married at the end of the film. And this is Sloan Wilson's picture on the back of his sequel, which never took off the way The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit did. This is Sloan Wilson's son. His name is David Sloan Wilson. He's a great genius who writes his own books on biology and physics. I've read some of them. He's wonderful. He's a physicist, a biological, actually, biology is his field at MIT or Harvard. Now, this car has to be the most gorgeous, sexiest car I've ever seen. It's a new Hudson from 1950. I don't remember what kind of car my father owned, but it didn't look anything like this. This is gorgeous. And this is generally what cars used to look like. Beautiful, big. We had plenty of room, plenty of gasoline, and the roads, well, you didn't get out of your car to put the gas in the tank. Nobody got out of their seat. Somebody would come, clean your car, do your windows, fill the tank, and the women took care of the tanks during the 40s when the men were away. And this is what a road might have looked like if you decided to drive somewhere in America during the 50s. Our general from the war, General Dwight David Eisenhower, was now the president, and he decided to build roads for all the Americans who, during the war, could not own a car. It was very rare to be able to buy a car easily, and now everybody's got one, so they wanted to use it. And this is what happened. Our country was now crisscrossed, east, west, north, and south. Plenty of room driving around until this happened. Or until this happened. I don't know where everybody's going, but must have been good. I think this is a funny picture because it's worse today. And when you went somewhere, How are you going to know? Let us say it was a long journey and you had to stay overnight. Where were you going to stay? Obviously, this sign is lit up because the vacancy is lit green with neon. The word motel is lit red with neon. Would you really want to stay in a place with a sign like this? I don't think so. And what happens in the 50s? This man, who lived in Tennessee and sold popcorn machines as a salesman, who drove around the country all the time, his name was Kemmons Wilson. He had 9 kids, and one summer in the 50s, he took his children and his wife in a giant station wagon, and boy, were they big back then, those station wagons, and he put them all in the car and he went to Washington, D.C. on a holiday. The trouble was you had motels like this along the way, and even as awful as this kind of motel was, they didn't want to take children, and he had 9 of them. He was so angry that even though he sold popcorn machines, he decided he was going to develop an idea for a motel chain that would be at every big highway along the highways across America for American families to travel safely, comfortably, sleep over somewhere safely. And so he developed an idea that this hotel chain, which he later named Holiday Inn, those are 4 of his lovely children cutting the ribbon for the opening of one of them. He developed this idea that along the roads of the United States, American families would never be turned away because they had a child. And so Holiday Inn, I never knew this actually myself until I read about it. I never tried to stay anywhere with a child that turned me away, like Jesus and Mary, the story of Jesus and Mary and Joseph being turned away at the inn, that kind of thing. And Kemmons Wilson was a very religious man. He developed the Holiday Inn chain of America. There are books written about his success and how it came about because it revolutionized hotels in this country and all over the world. The architect who drew up the plan happened to be watching Holiday Inn. I think it was on his television at the time, and he named the idea the hotel chain, which was just an idea. It wasn't even anything more than a blueprint. He named it Holiday Inn. And because Kemmons Wilson was a religious person, I guess he was a Baptist, he developed the way the chain still exists today. Everything about Holiday Inn today is pretty much established by the owner back in the 1950s, including the Bible in the drawer. Now, you've got these reliable hotel chains along the way, wherever you're going, but where are you going to eat? Look at this. I'm sure that Nick's Diner, well, I'm not so sure. I was going to say, I'm sure they had good food, but who knows? Would you risk your life walking through a door that looked like that? Or would you eat at Boondocks? Who knows? Or Phil's Diner? Who knows? You never know what you're going to find inside. So this fellow named Ray Kroc, I forget if his name is C-R-O-K or C-R-O-C-K, Ray Kroc, sold malted machines, and this is what it looked like back then. Here is the single malted machine that I remember very well. I loved malteds. That's why I was so fat when I was a kid. Oh, did I love malteds? And we drank a malted with a pretzel in Brooklyn. No other borough did they do that. If you ever see anybody dunk a big pretzel into a malted, then you know they have to be from Brooklyn. Yeah. And so Ray Kroc sold malted machines with multiple engines. And he crisscrossed America with this machine. He went to diners, restaurants, and he came upon two brothers in California. I believe it was San Diego, but I could have the place wrong. And their name was McDonald. McDonald was the brother's last name, and they had figured out a revolutionary method of keeping their little hamburger joint, drive up hamburger joint. They developed a way to keep it clean. What a mess. All of their clients were young kids, teenagers driving their daddy's car, 16, 17-year-old boys meeting the girls, and they would come to the hamburger joint and they would smear the ketchup and smear the mustard, and everything was a mess. The McDonald brothers were so fed up cleaning up after these kids that they developed something like Henry Ford's method of making cars, the assembly line technique, and they developed it. Necessity is the mother of invention, you know. So, in order to keep the place clean, they started packaging these hamburgers in paper wrappings with the pickle. Some hamburgers had no pickle, some hamburgers had ketchup, some hamburgers didn't have ketchup. And they would wrap them up and they sold them by the bag. Buy them by the bag, 15 cents a piece. And you could have your hamburger any which way, and you didn't have to touch the ketchup bottle or the mustard bottle. And the place was kept immaculately clean. And Roy Kroc loved cleanliness. And when he came to sell the malted machines to this pair of brothers, he couldn't believe what a successful place it was. So Roy Kroc bought them out for $1 million apiece. Can you imagine? This is a $1 trillion industry all over the planet by now. And the brothers never regretted being bought out by this malted machine salesman because they each got a life. They didn't have to work. They each had a Cadillac new every year. What was $1 million in 1950 something? It was a lot. It was like $100 million today. And so Roy Kroc sold these McDonald franchises all over the country. Originally, it started in Chicago, and the rest is history. What can I say? 15 cents. Yep. This was an innovation that changed not only our country at first, but the rest of the world. I visited my son, who was living in Finland many years ago, and he was horrified that I wanted to eat in McDonald's. And I said to him, well, how can I go back to Florida and not have eaten in McDonald's in Helsinki? Well, it was the same in Helsinki as it is in Florida. So here is a red jacket. What do you call these? A smoking jacket. That's what it's called, a smoking jacket. And when you see a red velvet smoking jacket, you think of only one person. His name was Hugh Hefner. And Hugh Hefner, this is a later photograph of him, but in the 1950s, he was a young fellow who heard, like everyone else did in the news, that this gorgeous drop dead woman, gorgeous, look at her, is she not gorgeous? The great Marilyn Monroe became a sex symbol in the 50s. And there was a scandal. This beautiful blonde had been blackmailed by a photographer who was trying to get money from MGM. Their biggest star had once or twice or a million times, who knows, posed naked for calendars. Now that she's a big movie star in Hollywood, surely MGM is going to want to give blackmail money to the photographer who still has negatives of Marilyn Monroe in the nude. And they were going to pay. I think it was 150,000, 200,000. The guy in Chicago was asking for this money. Otherwise, he's going to publish nude pictures of Marilyn Monroe and kill her future. Well, Marilyn Monroe was a unique woman. It's so sad that she died so young. But she said to MGM, are you crazy? Don't pay him even a nickel. I'm not ashamed of what I did. I had to do those things to make a living because I couldn't make a living as an actress. And don't you dare pay him any blackmail money. So the photographer didn't get his money from MGM, but he got his money from Hugh Hefner, who was a young fellow who recognized that young men who had been at war, they came back, and now in the 50s, there's something called a union. People back in the 30s and 40s literally worked themselves to death. They had no time for anything. Young men, and if you had relatives back in your grandmother's day or your parents' day, they never saw their families. They were working all the time. Unions could not protect them. And so in the 50s, everything changed. Men finally had leisure. Women didn't because they were raising the children and ironing and schlepping and doing laundry. And the men had so much leisure. What were they going to do? Well, Hugh Hefner had an answer, and this was it. He went and bought these photographs. This is the calendar for which Marilyn Monroe had posed. These are gorgeous pictures, and they're not pornographic at all. Here it is on the cover of the Spanish Playboy, which they repeated 30 years later. Hugh Hefner bought that photograph, and he used it as the cover of Playboy magazine that he created in the 1950s. Men had a magazine of their own. Now that the women had 100 magazines of their own, and you know the names of them: Woman's Day, Cosmopolitan, Ladies' Home Journal. Women had a million magazines, and the men, until Playboy came along, the men had nothing. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, there we are again, and here I had to interrupt the screen. This is a fellow that I was referring to, the new style of living in America, and this man is going to change everything about our country and the way we live. Look around, and you will see everywhere uh, self-contained communities. This man's name is William J. Levitt, and he actually built North Park in Hollywood, Florida. Was originally a Levitt community. William J. Levitt's father was Abraham Levitt from Brooklyn, who came to America with next to nothing and became quite a wealthy man. And he had two sons, William, and I'm sorry, I forget the brother's name. William J. Levitt and his brother were in the Seabees. This is the Naval Unit of Construction Building. As you see, they are building something here. I don't know. It is the Navy. And I love this photograph. This man. These are modern pictures of the Seabees. He's building a home, putting on the roof, and down here are many little houses. Back in the 50s, there was no house. Actually, during World War II, there was no housing. Everything had stopped. And even if the housing industry had continued in the 40s, it took a year at least to build a house. It had to be custom made. You had to get people who did the windows, and then you had to get people who did the roof. It was like making a custom tailored garment. A house would cost something like $9,000 to $15,000 for the average house, and most Americans didn't have that kind of money. Well, in the Seabees, the Levitt brothers had been building quickly. They were quickly building. That's what the Seabees construction battalion, CB, and they spell it Seabees like they're flying insects. We build and fight with all our might. And so it was this experience during World War II, and the end of the war was coming. Bill Levitt, he's known as Bill Levitt, he recognized that the GIs were all going to swoop up their girlfriends in their arms, and where were they going to live? With their in-laws. They were going to live in small, tiny, uh, in small tenement apartments like I grew up in. I knew all kinds of families that were living together because there was no affordable housing for middle class or even poor people. So they lived in Quonset huts. That was typical of the early 50s when the GIs came back. And it's the Levitt family that is going to create what you've already figured out is Levittown in Hempstead, Long Island. It was originally 1,000 acres of a potato field. Long Island is famous for potatoes. But remember what happened to the Irish in 1848. The potatoes had a blight. They had a disease that took them, uh, that created a starvation period for the poor Irish. And all the potatoes in Long Island in the 40s, the same thing happened to that area. And so the Levitt brothers took an option on 1,000 acres of that potato field in Hempstead, and they turned it into this amazing. Now, how they accomplished the building of such a community with, uh, let's see, there were 73,000 people living there and 35,000 homes, and they were built practically in a few months, within a year. And they built 150 houses a day. Yeah, I'm going to repeat that. 150 homes, private homes, with a yard and a fence. They built 150 each day, and this is how they did it. The Levitt brothers did not hire any union labor. None of the men in this photograph belonged to a union. That was a big problem, and the family avoided getting into, well, they were in trouble with the unions, but they continually hired non-union laborers, but they paid them extra wages so that nobody complained. Each man in this photograph, not one of them had ever built a house in their lives, but when they came there at 6 in the morning to the potato field, they were plopped down on a foundation. Now, look at this. There are no basements in any of these homes. This is a foundation of cement, and you couldn't go down into your basement because there were no basements. If they had to build a basement, it would have taken years and years. But that was the trick. If you're ever asked, how did Levittown ever get to be built so quickly? It's because there's no basement in any house. So the fellow sitting here, let us say he had a hammer and he went around as he walked from foundation to foundation. He hammered. He hammered nails. I don't know what else, but he hammered things. This guy, he had a screwdriver. He screwed things. This guy had a drill. He drilled things. On and on and on and on. Here is a fence. One of these fellows only did the fence. Here are the window frames. Another fellow did just the window frames. That is the technique that Henry Ford developed when he made all those cars. Millions of cars were turned out by the Ford Motor Company because of uh, the assembly line technique that was developed in that case. So that's what the Levitt family did. They reversed the assembly line. They took the men and walked the men from place to place to place to place. You couldn't move the houses on a moving conveyor belt, but you could move the men with the hammer, with the screwdriver, with the drill. And that is how Levittown got to look like this very, very quickly. Originally, they were rentals only to GIs, to veterans, and their rentals were very affordable and very cheap, something like $45 or $49 a month to rent. And then eventually they went up for sale. It became Levittown of Nassau County. They went up for sale to buy. And the price to buy was unbelievable. It was $6,000 for a house. And There was no money down because you were a GI. There was no money down, and the rent, the mortgage payments were less than if you rented the house. So everybody bought them. Then here is an original house in the modern day. I don't know when this picture was taken, maybe 10 years ago. And this is one of the very, very few original homes. And when I say original, I mean that nothing has been added to it. There's no garage added, there's no basement, of course, they couldn't do, no swimming pool, no extra rooms, no patios, no verandas. People did what they wanted with these homes, and they're worth a lot of money today, of course. And some of them went for $1 million. Here is an original home and the lovely family, very happy to be living with a dishwasher, brand new refrigerator, all the conveniences of wealthier people. Now the middle class can afford to live nice. And there's another nice family looking at their beautiful American dream. That's not a Levitt home, by the way. It's just a very sentimental photograph of what the 50s meant to families. Levitt's everything house, and it came with everything: a garbage disposer, a countertop range and oven, refrigerator, freezer, washer, dryer, sliding glass doors to the patio area. This is a home probably from the 60s, but Levitt went on to be a gigantic company until they went bust. And one of the reasons that they went, uh, William J. Levitt outlived all the rest of his family. He is in every history book for having invented the suburbs. Now, this is the Levittown in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. That was the second uh, Levittown that was built on the same order as the Levittown in Long Island. But in the summer of 1957, there was an altercation and somebody threw a rock through the window of one of the Levitt houses. A group began to gather. The neighbors were standing around watching as the police showed up. And then a bigger crowd arrived, and this went on for days and days and weeks in the summer, August of 1957. And here's an even bigger crowd with people giving speeches. This is the home of these are the Wexler. This is the Wexler family. They came to Bucks County, Levittown from the Bronx. They loved living in Levittown. They were so happy there. And they had friends named Miller, or Myers, sorry, not Miller, Myers, the Myers family. And that's William and Daisy Myers with their three lovely children. They were sold the same house as the Wexlers next door from another family that moved out. Now, the problem with this is obviously they're African American. But when most people never knew about Levittown homes, except for those who owned a Levittown home, in the contract when you bought it, in your mortgage or in your contract, you were not permitted to sell your home to any Negro family. It was in the contract. Everybody who bought homes knew that they were buying into an all-white community. And this, we're talking about Pennsylvania, New York, not Alabama or Missouri. So Bill Levitt, who is given credit for building the suburbs that America, the suburbs that sprawled out all over our country. He's responsible. His family built these self-contained communities that everybody wanted to live in. They came out of tenements, when life was beautiful, but it wasn't beautiful all the time. And William J. Levitt fought the civil rights legislations over and over and over. He spent fortunes of money defending himself and his business, claiming for all the world to hear in newspapers and books that if I built homes that were uh, available to Negro families, minority families, then I wouldn't make a living. Nobody would buy my houses. White people would never buy a house in which a Negro family might have lived next door. That was the premise on which Bill Levitt continually into the 1980s refused to change the contracts, refused to change the bylaws of all of his communities. He did change his mind in the 80s and he died in the the late 90s. I think he died 96. He had changed his mind about it, but by that time it was too late. The country was already uh, uh, interested in becoming racially equal, and we were getting better at that problem. But Bill Levitt resisted for decade and decade. His family, his brother was no longer alive, his father wasn't. He was just very stubborn. And it's very interesting to know this because he was not a Southerner, uh, and yet he kept claiming. Now, the thing about it is that Bill Levitt, whatever your beliefs are, he said he would not have sold a single house if white people knew that blacks could live there. Now, I grew up in a housing project. We moved in knowing that we were going to have black neighbors, and nobody cared. Not the Jews or the Italians or the Irish. We just moved into public housing because it was so wonderful and clean and modern. So, Bill Levitt, my point about this is that Bill Levitt never gave uh, an opportunity to the homeowners that he sold these homes to. He never gave them an opportunity to choose. Well, they did choose because after this, they allowed blacks to live in these communities and they moved in and there was no problem. Uh, it was against the bylaws, but Bill Levitt couldn't stand against the tide of the future and modernity in our country and racial equality in our country. And it's Daisy Myers watching out for another rock that might be thrown through her kitchen. And they lived there all their lives. They didn't move out and they were very courageous. So here are some pictures of the advertisements of another Levittown community. And that's Bess Meyerson selling her Westinghouse refrigerators. She wore fabulous clothing, and the commercials on television were all live. They were not on videotape at all. So women would sit down and watch these commercials because they wanted to see what Bess Meyerson was going to wear next. She was lovely. And look at this woman. I love this advertisement for a stove. She's all dressed up, stockings, high heels, and a suit or a dress. It looks like she's got gloves, but no. Uh, yeah, those were the new appliances. This was a Levitt kitchen, and this was Eugene Furkauf. I'm sure you don't recognize his face, but you certainly remember his business. It was called E.J. Corvette. And if you lived in Chicago, Illinois, or New York State, then you knew about E.J. Corvette. And no, it has nothing to do with the Korean War. Everybody asks this question. 8 Korean vets? No, 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 that's a rumor. He didn't name the business after Korea. He named it after a car called a Corvette. And Eugene Furkauf decided that he was going to he went to Tilden High School in Brooklyn, and his father had a luggage shop on Madison Avenue, and he didn't like the way his father did business. His father was too slow, too elderly, old fashioned. He had spilkus. He was gonna do things quickly, quickly. He was gonna make a smaller profit, but he was gonna turn it over very fast. And he did this with washing machines. He did this with refrigerators. He did this with the biggest of appliances. When he started his little business on 47th Street and Fifth Avenue, Eugene Furkauf was selling refrigerators for a $15 or $20 profit. Yes, $15 or $20 profit. You could, before Furkauf came along and created discount shopping, wholesale or discount shopping, there was only one thing you could do. Well, you had a choice in the 50s. You could go to Macy's to buy your refrigerator, or you could go to Gimbel's. And they were the same price, maybe $5 difference, whatever. Gimbel's, Macy's, tough luck. That's all you had. But when Eugene Furkauf started this industry of wholesale shopping or discount shopping, you could go and buy a refrigerator for much less money. The man who was selling it to you was making only $10 or $15. Macy's and Gimbel's couldn't afford to do that. They couldn't. They never thought of it. They sold you a refrigerator for 200. They were making $100. But Eugene sold it to you for 150. He was making $10 or $15, and that was the difference that made him a very rich man. And he sold a lot of these contraptions. In the 40s, nobody knew what this television was going to, well, in the 40s, nobody even wanted it. It had nothing interesting on it. And what was it going to be useful for? We didn't know. Well, we found out. Lucille Ball, Desi Arnaz, and the Mertzes, the Ricardos and the Mertzes are going to move just like everyone else in the big cities. They are going to move to the suburbs too, and they do move to Connecticut eventually. But this is the man for whom television just burst out of the door of every uh, store in America, especially in the big cities like New York and Los Angeles, Chicago and Boston, Philadelphia. Everybody living in those cities, they couldn't wait to see Uncle Milty. Every week he was a crazier character than the week before. Look at this, Cleopatra. Is this a Meshuggah or what? The problem with Uncle Milty, who sold more televisions than any salesman ever could, because everybody had to see him now. Now they understood what television was going to be good for. Uncle Milty, he would go on forever. Well, no, he wouldn't, because what happens is that when the cables or the connections for television came to Kansas, Arkansas, Nevada, Utah, the middle of the country took a look at this crazy person and they said, "Feh, we don't want to buy a television for this reason." Ugh, disgusting. They had no understanding of why anybody would laugh at Uncle Milty. For this reason, the television company, and I don't remember if it was NBC, they had to get rid of this program. It was killing their ratings, it was killing the sales of television. They had to present something more likable to the people in the Midwest. They got rid of Uncle Milton by by paying him off. He had a 20-year contract for a lot of money each year. I don't remember the number, but it was many millions in the end. The company had to continually pay Milton Berle. Here he is. He looks very happy because he's a very wealthy man. He never worked another day in his life and was paid by NBC to just stay away. That's it. Just stay away, leave us alone, and don't no more. What was her name? Carmen Miranda. Forget about it. These were the people who made 16 years. Now, if someone were to ask you who or what sitcom on 1950s television was the most popular, I would have said Lucy. I Love Lucy was, to me, even now, the greatest sitcom I ever watched in my life. but it was not the most popular. This was the most popular. And boy, was I disappointed when I found that out, because to me, as a child in the 50s, these people were from planet Mars, some other planet they came from. I never knew in my childhood any children, when they sat at the dinner table, said, "Please, may I have the salt?" "Yes, thank you." "Please pass the pepper." "Thank you very much." I didn't know children like that. None of my friends knew children like that. In fact, I didn't have a mother like Mrs. Nelson here. Harriet had pearls around her neck in the kitchen. Every hair was in place. She was pretty and clean. Not a single day in any episode that I ever saw did she say that she was ausgemitched, yeah, weg, leave me alone, stop shouting, stop yelling, stop. No, no. She was calm and perfect. The children were perfect. Her husband, he sat in the living room in a suit, reading a newspaper with his feet up. I didn't know any father like that either. These people were from another planet, but they were the representation in America of what American values, family values, were going to be defined as. They were going to teach all of us with our new apartments and our new houses and our new dishwashers and our new cars. They were going to teach us how to be 100% red blooded, patriotic Americans against communism and everything that's dirty in life. They were purity 100%. There's only one problem with this. They were, in their actual lives, the most dysfunctional family on television. They were. They lived on the set their whole life, their names, their living room, everything was on television before the public. They had a son who was a drug addict who was going to die young. They were not a happy family in reality. But the adventures of Ozzie and Harriet were on TV the most popular, longest running original sitcom ever in the history of television. And when it came to family values, it was Ed Sullivan who believed that he was the entrepreneur of family values. He was going to dictate what American families could watch and not watch. So when this fellow showed up on the Milton Berle show, and before Milton Berle went off the air, he was a rival to the Ed Sullivan show, and Milton Berle's ratings went zooming up the sky, all because this fellow, who looks like he's actually imitating Jerry Lewis in this photograph, but Elvis Presley made Milton Berle's ratings hit the roof. Ratings became everything in television. Ed Sullivan did not know it. This is another view of Elvis Presley on the Milton Berle show, and there he is gyrating. So Ed Sullivan had no choice. He was going to lose his own show if he didn't compete with this fellow from Tennessee, and he had no choice but to put Elvis Presley on his own show, even though he detested Elvis. He thought, like my mother and father, I have to admit, when I was 12, I went out with my allowance money for $1. I'll never forget it. I bought a record, and it was called "You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog." I was in love with that music, and Elvis Presley was my idol. My mother and father truly believed that I had now become a juvenile delinquent. That is what Ed Sullivan believed as well, that if children would watch Elvis, automatically they would be bedazzled by his juvenile delinquency. Well, it didn't come to pass because, as I now can tell you, my husband, who's been a singer all of his life, used to imitate Elvis on the stages all over the Catskill Mountains. And elderly women in their 80s, I watched them do it all the time. They would throw their keys on the stage at my husband when he imitated Elvis Presley. And I always laughed because those ladies who were throwing their keys at my husband. When they were raising their children, they were probably punishing their daughters for even thinking about Elvis Presley, much less watching him. How times have changed. It's really amazing. But this is the family that was totally dysfunctional in their personal lives, who represented 100% red blooded Americanism. And I don't think you could have found a bigger eagle than the one over their mantelpiece. And here it's all going to be uh, changed forever. There's no turning back after Marlon Brando, no turning back. He was raised by a woman named Stella Adler, whose family were the famous Jewish theatrical family. Uh, Joseph P. Adler and Celia Adler. Luther Adler was Stella's brother. and and Marlon Brando was literally, not literally, but he was adopted by the Adler family in New York City. And he was taught by Stella, who had gone to Europe in the 30s and learned acting from the greatest drama coach in the history of drama and movies. His name was Stanislavs, it's a mouthful, Konstantin Stanislavski. And it was called the method, the Stanislavski method. It was brought to America by people like Stella Adler, and it was given to it was taught to Marlon Brando. So think about this. In the 40s and the 50s, if you saw a movie with Jimmy Stewart, let us say Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and then another movie with Jimmy Stewart like It's a Wonderful Life, the man playing the same Jimmy Stewart, the same actor, is the same person in both of those films. There's no difference between his acting and his personality in either of those films. Marlon Brando studied the Stanislavski method, which created a new system of acting. We have him to thank, even if you don't like Marlon Brando. He's in every single history book that deals with this issue because he broke the mold. No longer was an actor going to be the same in every character, in every portrayal, in every movie. Marlon Brando is not the same person or character in any of his movies. And so we have this man who was drop dead gorgeous, and he's he's the reason we have such wonderful acting. He's the historical breakthrough, in other words. So I hope that you've remembered some of these things. If not, you can read the book by David Halberstam. It's called The Fifties. It's 800 pages, so you could pick and choose whatever you want to read about. It's got politics, which I left out of this lecture. Maybe I'll do a sequel. Thank you very much. Let's get back to stop share, and I'll say goodbye. Good luck and stay well to all of you. Bye.